All right, thanks for being back, and I think we have more people coming back as they are rounding them up outside and pushing them in the doors, because 10 minutes isn't long, but we're getting through a lot of great material today. Dr. David Scharia is the Director and Chief of Branch for the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate. Let's welcome our next framing speaker.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. I want to start by first what the protocol dictates, which is thanking Ali Soufan and the Soufan Center, but I want to go a little bit beyond that, because I think I attended in my career probably hundreds of counterterrorism conferences, if not more, but certainly hundreds. And I cannot recall a conference which put at the center victims and survivors of terrorism as this one. And I think it speaks a lot about the Soufan group and what they are standing for. So I want to thank Ali personally for inviting me, and I want to thank Ali and the Soufan Center for putting survivors and victims of terrorism at the center of this conversation. It doesn't happen very often, and it certainly doesn't happen enough. I want also to thank you for initiating, when this conference was introduced to us for the first time by Ali and his team, they introduced the concept of the 10th of September project, and a research project that will actually try to look how can the next 11th of September be prevented. And I've been sitting here and learning so much in the last day and a half and asking myself, if we had been here, all of us, with practically thousands of years of counterterrorism experience in this room, thousands of years collectively, at 10th of September 2001, would have we prevented, would have been able to imagine 11th of September? Probably not, and probably not prevent it. And that is basically what this next panel will focus on. How can we prevent the next 11th of September? There was a lot of discussion so far about intelligence cooperation, better law enforcement tool, better border controls tools. All of these are important, but would they alone prevent the next 9/11? Probably they will prevent, but I'm not sure they will prevent the next planning. Because what happened since 11th of September 2001, over a period of more than 20 years, is that our understanding of what causes people to join the terrorist organizations has evolved so much. As many of you know, right after the attack on 9/11, the Security Council adopted a landmark resolution that I'm sure everybody in this room knows, Resolution 1373, and it contains all the elements of what have been discussed: law enforcement, financing of terrorism, border control, international cooperation, intelligence cooperation. It took us a quarter of a century almost to understand that to prevent terrorism, we need so much more. We need to understand what drives people to engage in such activities, and how can we reduce the motivation of people to join them. And this journey that CITED, the body I work for, has been an important part of its evolvement, led us to understand so much more about the terrorism phenomena. We have learned that some of our actions are counterproductive. that sometimes, I think it was mentioned in one of the previous panels, our counter-terrorism efforts only produce more terrorists, more potential terrorists. We learned over the years that to limit the partners and players just to those who are counter-terrorism professionals doesn't necessarily reduce the threat. We need to engage communities. We need to engage religious leaders. We need to engage vulnerable communities and vulnerable people. We learned so much about the radicalization process. And all this will be the topic of the next panel. In the Security Council, we were able and seated, the Counter-Terrorism Executive Director was and still is an important player in enabling the UN Security Council to absorb all these concepts into counterterrorism policies that member states engage in. But there's also one thing that I want to stress and I want to conclude because the panel will be probably much more interesting than what I have to say, is that when we speak about counterterrorism and drivers, we have to be careful in this discussion because it runs the risk of guilt, it runs the risk of moral ambivalence. And having the survivors and the victims in this room helps us frame the conversation in the right way. Because as much as we talk a lot about how many mistakes we have made and how many wrong policies have been adopted over the last quarter century, we have to remember that terrorism is never justified. And we don't want to go into the path of questioning and asking how much we have done wrong, leading us to think that terrorism is in some way justifiable. Security Council, whenever it decides on counterterrorism issues, it starts with a frame that is so often used that terrorism is never justified. It is never justified, and that is not never justified, but. It's not just never justified, however. We want to understand the drivers. We want to learn more what causes people to engage in such activities, but we should be careful not to have anyone understand or question the moral outrage that we have whenever we encounter the terrorist phenomena. So I think I'll stop here. That has been my framing. I don't know if the panelists will agree with that, but I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting discussion. So thank you again, Sufan Group, for inviting me and inviting Sita to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Dr. Scharia. Our next panel is keying off those remarks. Recruitment and Radicalization, Root Causes, Grievances, and the Drivers of Terrorism, which is going to be moderated by my old ABC News colleague, Deb Amos. She's going to be joined by Javed Ali, one of the premier analysts in the counterterrorism world, and I think I've worked everywhere he's worked, somewhere at the same time. Eric Rosend, Executive Director of Strong Cities Network. Farah Pandith, former chair of the Task Force for Countering Violent Extremism at the Department of Homeland Security Advisory Council, and adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Rachel Attlee, head of political analysis and research at the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate. Let's welcome our next panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being the people who just stay with us. And I think we're going to make it worth your while. This panel, in some ways, is an expansion of what we heard this morning. We are going to talk about root causes and grievances and give some more data to what we heard this morning about radicalization and what it means, and how do we combat it, and do we even know how to do that? We have a great panel, and what I've asked each one of them to do is just give a little opener on what they do, so that you have a sense of it, and then we will have a conversation as we've been having all afternoon. So I'm going to welcome you to do that, and we'll come this way. So Ali, can you go first, if you don't mind?
Sure. So first, as everyone who's been up here has said repeatedly throughout the last 2 days, thank you to Ali Soufan, to Colin, to John Miller, for everyone involved with the Soufan Center, for bringing me here, certainly on the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. This conference has also been interesting for me, that 3 of my former bosses in government were here, Matt Olson, Nick Rasmussen, and Chris Costa, who we just heard from as well, so hopefully they don't share their performance reviews of me with you. But again, tremendous honor for me to be here. And maybe one thing that I'll do, in the same way that Chris Costa did, is kind of wind back the clock to a moment in time that certainly was pivotal for my career. And as John mentioned, I had a lot of different roles in counterterrorism analysis. And one of those, going back to 2010, 2011 timeframe, I was on a detail assignment from the FBI. That was my home agency. And I had a chance to go to a place that a lot of people probably have never heard of, certainly outside the intelligence community, and maybe even inside the intelligence community, it's kind of a mystery, but a place called the National Intelligence Council. And for those of you familiar with it, it really is the premier analytic organization in our U.S. national intelligence enterprise, where you have the convening authority to bring the entire U.S. intelligence community together to tackle the hardest intelligence issues of the day, whether they are driven top-down by policymakers, questions from folks like Farah in her previous roles, or sort of from the bottom up of analysts, or former analysts like myself, to say, okay, there's been something going on, and we need to figure out how to address it to inform policy. So when I got there, and I had spent several years in the intelligence community before at places like the Defense Intelligence Agency, Department of Homeland Security, and then my home position in the FBI, one thing that was just truly captivated by and trying to figure out was, how is this process and phenomena of jihadist radicalization occurring here inside the United States? Because in my previous roles, I was trying to figure out what that looked like overseas, and I spent a lot of time traveling overseas to get some comparative perspective and pick a country. How are they dealing with that jihadist threat in their midst, and what, if anything, could we do either from the DHS side or then the FBI side, and then informing the leadership in those organizations. So fast forward a few years, now I'm at this place called the National Intelligence Council, trying to bring everyone together. So bottom line, we did a lot of hard work. We broke some new ground analytically and put out a national level assessment that tried to sort of paint this picture of, again, what had happened in the United States, how did it happen, what were the key factors that was driving this phenomena, how bad would it look in the future, the sort of basic analytic questions you try to answer in any product, but this was a very special and very different one. And just without going into anything super classified, but sort of some of the key takeaways on things, now going back 15 years, that were certainly driving that phenomena in the US in that very unique period of time. And this is no great surprise probably to anybody. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were clearly affecting jihadist radicalization and mobilization and then violent action here in the US. And it wasn't just the policy decisions to go to war. It was then, once the wars happened, what were either US troops doing, coalition troops, civilian casualties became a major issue in the jihadist narrative. And again, that affected people in these different phases that I just described. But beyond the wars in Iraq, Gitmo, Abu Ghraib, the sort of treatment of detainees, those we would see time and time again when someone got arrested or detained, that was also baked into their either ideology or the decision to try to conduct an attack here in the US, even though they weren't formally part of Al-Qaeda or other jihadist groups. Another interesting feature of that time was the way technology was moving. And so the early days of Al-Qaeda from the 80s into the 1990s, they didn't have the internet and social media for the most part to sort of mobilize people, but going to the 2010s, that they clearly did, and that was another factor, the social media aspect of this. the ability to put out jihadist propaganda finally in the late 2000s in English language and Western language media, that was also something we used to spend a lot of time worrying about the next edition of Inspire or things like that that were coming out. How many dozens or hundreds of people in the US would actually try to do something on behalf of that? And then another really unique feature in that period of time, and thankfully I don't think we've seen someone like that since, is the role of Anwar al-Awlaki as sort of the Pied Piper for Western jihadists up until his death in 2011. And we'll probably never know in the United States or in the West how many people Awlaki himself influenced. Maybe not directly, although in previous years you could actually reach out to him and he would email you back or communicate with you. But you cannot underestimate Awlaki's influence on the jihadist threat in the US up until 2011. Time and time again, you would see that influence and affect the decision of some people to actually want to conduct attacks here or successfully conduct attacks. So that's a broad level overview and that snapshot in time of some of these key factors. But here we are almost 15 years later, and I think the world is very different from that perspective.
Thanks. Eric, you play a different role from almost everybody on this panel. Can you explain what you work on?
Sure. I'm currently the executive director of the Strong Cities Network, and we are a global network of 243 cities working on preventing and responding to hate, extremism, and polarization. But I think before I say a little bit about that, and just to sort of explain how I got there, and it might be somewhat relevant to this conversation, which is some 22 years ago, I was working for the U.S. mission to the United Nations, and I was assigned what had been a very moribund counterterrorism portfolio at the UN. And this was just after 9/11 when all of a sudden things mushroomed and counterterrorism became the big thing at the UN. And there were all sorts of committees being set up at the United Nations Security Council. David Scharia is one of the senior staff members in one of the staff bodies. And all of a sudden counterterrorism became a big thing at the UN. And I was sitting there thinking, how disconnected the conversations were in the Security Council and the General Assembly from actual realities on the ground, from actually what counterterrorism practitioners, whether in Washington or other capitals or in the field, were really caring about. But there was this expectation at the global level in the UN that it was going to be the be-all and end-all of cooperation. And so quickly I started, not that quickly, but relatively quickly, it dawned on me that there has to be a better way to do international counterterrorism cooperation if you really want to get to the issues. And how do you get beyond the diplomacy, and how do you get the practitioners talking to each other at a global level from key countries? And that led eventually to the creation of a body called the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which was outside the UN, which was supposed to be nimble, action-oriented, getting all the practitioners together from the key countries. And then it quickly became clear that, wait a minute, it was still too far removed from the realities on the ground. And so fast forward, and we move away from countering, given all the lessons we've learned about the sort of fallouts from the wrong kind of counterterrorism. And all of a sudden people started realizing that actually the issues is not so much killing and capturing people on the battlefield, it's actually preventing people from wanting to go on the battlefield in the first place, and understanding why people become terrorists, understanding why people become radicalized. And that obviously meant more emphasis on prevention. You can't do prevention at the global level, you have to do prevention at the local level. And so this led to then, in the Obama administration, we started spawning what was called the Preventing Violent Extremism global effort. And one way to institutionalize that beyond a single presidential administration is to sort of spawn lots of international initiatives that can live on their own. One of which was the Strong Cities Network. And that started in 2015, and I came back 3.5 years ago, having left government, to lead it. And we are all about really understanding the perspective of mayors, the perspective of local governments, and their work with communities, and really channeling that up to the national and global level, so that those conversations about how to counter the threats on the ground are actually informed by the people who know best. And it's not really an individual civil society group, it's not really, because they do know about their little community, but it's really the local government. The local government is engaging with the population. The local government has the relationships. The local government often has the trust, certainly more than the national government, but they've historically been excluded from 20-plus years of counterterrorism or 20-plus years of countering violent extremism. And so what we do as a network is try to both empower and support local governments around the world, understand what they need, understand what their concerns are, and then give them the tools, often through peer-to-peer learning, to build their capacity, but also to help them advocate up, whether in the national level, so that when there is a national strategy for countering violent extremism that's supposed to be dealing with local issues, that local governments and mayors are actually aware of that strategy. Because oftentimes, including in this country, when the White House develops a strategy, it's not particularly consultative. They'll talk about a whole of society approach, but do they actually consult with society? Probably not. And you can replicate that around the world. So how do you get mayors, local government voices there? How can you really understand through them what is driving young people in their communities or older people in their communities? What are the grievances that are making certain parts of the population more vulnerable to extremism? And chances are that more counterterrorism at the national level and more counterterrorism at the global level is not going to help address those grievances. So if you really want to not be here 23 years from today and have a 46th anniversary of 9/11 with the same kind of conversations about counterterrorism and the jihadi threats, maybe we should try to flip it a little bit and actually really invest and double down on these local approaches in a way that we've never done, and I'm sure Farah can talk more about that, but we talk about it a lot, but the investments never follow, and the consistency never follows, and the discipline never follows. So hopefully that can be sort of one of the future homework assignments.
Okay. Rachel?
Thank you very much, Deborah. So I am a researcher. I'm a research coordinator at the United Nations who works on terrorism. And so I have read almost everything that the Soufan Center puts out on terrorism. So if anything I say or any of my ideas sound like a little too familiar, it's not plagiarism. It is UN engagement with academia and civil society, which is a very important part of our mandate. Last year at the Security Council hosted a meeting on terrorism in March, and the UN Secretary General referred to terrorism as both the root and the result of much of the Security Council's topics of its international peace and security agenda. And I think that's quite helpful framing of how the UN sees terrorism as sometimes cyclical, both a cause and effect. And government interventions can go either way. They can either break that cycle or they can perpetuate that cycle if the balance isn't struck correctly in the way that the other panelists have already sort of addressed. And my organization, CTED, is in the business of, among other things, traveling from country to country and assessing the way that governments do those interventions and offering advice and recommendations on how to conduct those interventions in a better way to have a better outcome and hopefully break those cycles. We have visited 36 countries since that sort of pandemic lull in travel. And so we have a fairly good idea of what the grievances, drivers, conditions conducive to terrorism picture looks like at the moment, and also the effectiveness of government interventions. And it's mixed. Some countries need more work. Some countries have an over-securitized approach. They target minorities, or they aren't sufficiently engaging with communities. And there are lots of really encouraging examples of member states of the United Nations who have really comprehensive plans to identify grievances and address conditions conducive to terrorism. They both consult with and engage and involve civil society, academia, religious leaders in plans to develop ways of countering those grievances and countering conditions conducive to terrorism. Multidisciplinary teams, whole of society approaches, all that good stuff. But even those places, many of those places that have excellent plans, still struggle to get the balance right, and it's a very difficult balance to strike between engaging religious communities without targeting them, engaging schools without securitizing them, involving minorities without stigmatizing them. It's a very difficult balance to strike, and it is difficult to get the balance right between identifying and addressing those conditions without exacerbating them. And that's just the baseline, and then you add in additional factors and compounding factors like technology, that individuals that have lone grievances can now identify one another and connect with one another and perpetuate their grievances. Governments are struggling with that. Even when you're able to identify the conditions in your own nation and reach out to communities, you also need to be aware of grievances and problems happening everywhere else in the world, because technology is connecting these people together. We spoke to 2 countries in Asia in the last couple of years that told us that while they know they don't have a huge problem, or they're not really worried about extreme content online being produced by their own citizens in their own languages, they're really worried about what their citizens are seeing that are coming from elsewhere and the grievances that are being perpetuated. So that's just another compounding factor. In those 36 countries that we visited, none are getting it right, but we do see really encouraging examples. We've seen some great programs in Southeast Asia, Europe, and Africa. We've seen a few countries in Africa now really trying to build those comprehensive plans to address and identify grievances, so it's encouraging.
Ferris.
Good afternoon to everybody. Ooh, I should turn this on. Good afternoon to everyone, and a special thank you to Ali Soufan, who is an old friend and a dear friend and a pioneer in so much. Thank you for having me here. I will give a couple of perspectives based on what both Javed and Eric have said, and then I want to talk about sort of the larger landscape that we are in. I, like Javed, came to the table working on this issue right after 9/11. I have focused the last 23 years of my life thinking about 9/11 every single day. I am not exaggerating. I've been very fortunate to work in government where instead of working on kinetic component, I was asked to look at the question of why, at the time, why young Muslims found it appealing to join a group like Al-Qaeda. And the US government, right after 9/11, as many people in this room know, weren't focused on the ideological component of what AQ was trying to do. They didn't know what the narratives were. They didn't understand what was so appealing about blowing yourself up and killing others. Our approach in the beginning was haphazard. We were trying to make sure that we made every effort not to talk about the religion of Islam, but also understood that AQ wasn't going after Jews and Christians that were trying to recruit Muslims. We as a country were trying to mobilize the interagency to look at soft power in a different way. We just didn't have the tools to be able to do this work. We were building things from nothing. I have old memories of Javed and I sitting at the bottom of the EEOB with red pens in our hand, going through the national security strategy, trying to figure out how to think about things and say things in a particular way. We as a nation have come a long way since that time. But what we still haven't done is to do the thing that I was asked to do in 2003, which is, could you please tell us what we need to be doing as Americans and with our allies to stop people from finding the ideology of these horrific organizations appealing? And through that time, we've just heard a lot of approaches that we have taken to try to get to the what is happening inside of the young person that is making them do what they do. And I will say we've learned so much in 2 decades about the drivers and the amount of academic research that has gone into what radicalizes people, what's happening on the behavioral side, what are the instigators, what can we do at the grassroots. We didn't have all that information after 9/11. The work that I did in both the Bush and the Obama administrations was to try to put together these ideas into action. And so we piloted in the Bush administration the concept of countering violent extremism, which was the soft power arm to try to make sure that ecosystems were were in the defense posture to external actors coming in, trying to recruit young people. And we learned really early on that, in fact, the government has a very limited role to play, obviously. You all know this. It's what's happening on the ground. What are parents saying? What are faith leaders saying? What are community activists saying? And can we as the United States government be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we heard on the ground? That's the work that Javed and Eric and I have done for 20 years. A lot has happened in that time, and we know that, I'm so glad you brought up Abu Ghraib. I can tell you that there were spikes when we didn't have the technology infrastructure that's in place today. You said bin Laden didn't have those tools, but remember that he had YouTube. And remember that as the US government, we allowed bin Laden to spew his grossness on YouTube for hours on end because we as a government didn't have a policy on what we do about some guy who is preaching his thing. And we had to learn that. And I'm only saying that because that's where we started, and we're in a very different place today. So what do I do in my life these days? I'm trying to surge this concept of soft power in a bigger way. I'm trying to understand what's happening with 3 specific generations: millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. All of us have heard on this stage earlier in many amazing panels the young people who are finding extremism appealing, whether it is a neo-Nazi group or it's ISIS, and everything in between. Something radically different is happening today to our young people. And I think it's incumbent on all of society, whether it's government or civil society, to think differently about the drivers in the ecosystem that is making a young person move in a direction of violence. We all know about the mental health crisis that's happening with young kids. We know about the anxiety and fear these young people feel. We all read what experts say about social media and how people respond to it, and how if a brain does not get developed until the age of 24, if you're giving a child a cell phone for 7 hours a day, something is happening to their brain. We've all read those articles, but what we haven't done is we haven't, as a community of experts, all of you and others who are not here, combined forces to actually figure out how we have a 24/7 response and an ecosystem that can respond to global things, not just Gaza, not just a horrific thing that is equivalent to an Abu Ghraib, but to utilize the information that we have to fortify these kids from what it is that we know could happen. That's what I'm struggling with today. That is my work and in my passion. I feel very strongly that we've missed some major black holes that are still not there. We haven't done enough work to understand what's happening in other parts of the world. We heard a panel on what's happening in Africa, but we don't put the resources behind that. We know that weird things are happening in South Asia, but we don't spend the time talking about it other than to ourselves who are all in this field. Something really weird is happening in Central Asia, and yet I never hear anybody talking about that. The one thing that I will say, and then I'll stop, is when I was special representative to Muslim communities in the Obama administration, I traveled to nearly 100 countries. And I had spent time in the Bush administration going throughout Europe talking to young Muslims in 55 cities and 19 countries. And in that experience in the Bush administration, I was shocked as an American Muslim to hear them talk about their identity, to have them say, we don't know the difference between religion and culture. We don't know how to be. We don't know how to belong. We don't know. And those were questions that they were asking in 2007, 2008, and 2009. And I thought they were asking those questions because they were minorities in Europe, and I just thought it was unique to Europe. And we were going around as Americans talking about how that kind of identity crisis could never happen in America. Fast forward, when I was special representative to Muslim communities and I was going to countries that were Muslim majority countries, what was odd was that that identity crisis was happening too, in Pakistan, in Malaysia, in Morocco. Muslim majority countries where young Muslims were saying to me, I don't know the difference between culture and religion. And the reason why that was important for me, obviously, is because AQ and ISIS were going to tell you how to be a good Muslim. Now, all of this to say, when you ask the question about what are the drivers or what's happening, for me, in the experience that I've had, it is both the things that they're seeing on their phone combined with what's happening internally. And for us to get this right, it means that that identity crisis and that sense of belonging has to come together with the expertise in this room and on this stage.
You know, one of the things that happens when you're a moderator is you whisper in the back and somebody says there's too much CT and everybody goes, yeah, there's too much counterterrorism. So my question to all of you, because you brought it up, is this: what would it look, first, why? Yeah. Why is CT the answer that you get? And how would it look different if you as a panel, because you all said the same thing, how would it look different if you got your way?
I'll take a stab at that. So I left government in 2018, and now I am comfortably in academia and have no plans to go back to government. But one of the things that I teach is a counterterrorism class, and over the years, as that class has evolved and my own thinking on counterterrorism has evolved from just the perspective of not being in the machine anymore, one thing I really try to get students to focus on in this counterterrorism class in particular are the counterterrorism tools that the US government has used over both in the post 9/11 era and then the pre 9/11 era. And interestingly, and I literally just had this lecture with my students on Wednesday, when I showed this very dynamic slide about this broad spectrum of counterterrorism tools that, again, we have used over now decades. You can see the way I've kind of architected the slide, and maybe it's sort of, I'm intentionally biasing, kind of where we're strong as the US government. We're very strong, and FARA and others have said that, we're very strong on the kinetic side, both on the military and the law enforcement side. That is where time and time again, you see that part of the counterterrorism toolkit being applied with great effects, but for the most part at a tactical level, where we're not very good at. And again, this counterterrorism tools kind of schema that I've painted, and it's evolved over the years, where we're really still weak, and I would argue 23 years later, even though, again, I've been out of government for a long time, is on the prevention side and the countering side. And that is where either, no matter how you assess that, dollars, budgets, resource, people, programs, it pales in comparison by orders of magnitude to the hard edge tools in the CT toolkit. Now, to Eric, to your point, 23 years from now, will that look completely different? But if we don't address that, we're going to be stuck in this condition we're in now, where we can hit targets all day long, we can arrest people all day long, and the threat, if anything, may look worse.
Remember the why part. Why is it like this?
We haven't, I mean, one of the things that we don't do is think out of the box in terms of what's possible. We tend to think that there's a toolbox and it's firm and there are only certain tools in that toolbox. We've never expanded our thinking. Contrary to what happens at the Department of Defense, there are places in the Department of Defense that thinks very creatively, whether it's a DARPA or whatever, that thinks about ways to handle a crisis in a new way. They bring different kinds of people to the table to say, how would you solve this? We've never done that with trying to diminish the ideological soldiers. For an ecosystem and a landscape to change, it means that we need to put new things in it, because what's in it right now isn't working. That we can all agree on.
So I think we created this ecosystem, this counterterrorism ecosystem, whether it's in the intelligence community, whether it's in the defense community, whether it's in the multilateral community, that just goes on and on and on. And while our, like this current administration, they've intentionally downplayed counterterrorism as a thing. No longer is counterterrorism going to wag the foreign policy dog. They haven't put counterterrorism back in the box. They've just let it sit and not get attention and atrophy a little bit. So, for example, this coming week, you have, at the UN, you have lots of counterterrorism, global counterterrorism meetings of the Global Counterterrorism Forum and such. And then the following week in Washington, you have the Counter-ISIS Coalition ministerial meeting, right? Do you really need all these counterterrorism bodies anymore? Or are they just too hard to put back in the box? And I would argue, the more you keep these things going, the more money it takes to keep them going, and the less money there is for prevention. So at some point, someone has to say, we look at 20 plus years of counterterrorism, radicalization has gotten worse, not better, not less. The threat has metastasized. Now the counter-ISIS coalition is now looking at West Africa. They're looking all over the place because it's so globalized. And it just begs the question, is an administration going to come into the White House and say, enough's enough, and that we have to really downsize counterterrorism, not take our eye off the terrorist threat, but figure out why we are still in this cycle, and why, despite everything that, and it's not just those of us in this panel, the collective wisdom of most people in the counterterrorism community is that we have not spent enough money or time on prevention. We understand why people get radicalized. It has a lot to do with the conditions on the ground in their lives. It has a lot to do with how governments treat them. It has a lot to do with mental health and other factors, but we're nowhere near close to investing even a small percentage of what you need to invest on that. So just look at the Counterterrorism Bureau at the State Department, which I know best. They have, let's say, this is a small budget, but let's say they have a $200 million budget a year on supporting in third countries. I would say less than 2% of that budget goes to prevention. I would say 98% goes to law enforcement training, training bomb-sniffing dogs in third countries, but practically nothing goes to dealing with all the things that we've talked about is actually the problem. So, and that's just a small piece of the US government budget. But I imagine if you look at other parts of the system, it's similar. And then the last point is, some would argue, well, prevention is really a development thing. It's really a governance thing. It's really a US Agency for International Development thing. Well, I don't see any USAID people in this room. I don't see any governance or democracy or development people in this room. And for many, many years, me, along with many other people, have been saying, we will have made significant progress when these kinds of conversations are 50-50. You have the security people and you have the development people, and you're actually talking about these problems together, but you don't have that.
Rachel, can I ask you to talk a little bit about who now is radicalized? I mean, 23 years ago, it was a bunch of guys. That's not how it is anymore.
I just wanted to say... It went off. I just wanted to highlight also a point that Eric just made, that we do know what is causing radicalization, and we do know who is being radicalized, and we do understand a lot of this stuff. And I might be putting myself out of a job because researchers are supposed to say what we need is more research. But actually, so many researchers in this room know we already have plenty. Perhaps we're just not reading it, and we may not be actioning it, and therefore we're not getting that balance right. The UN Development Programme, UNDP, has done amazing research, excellent research in lots of different parts of the world, Africa, Southeast Asia, and others. Really compelling data that shows a very clear picture of what is driving people to join terrorist organizations and commit these acts. The data is in front of us. And CTED is also a leader in its research work. A couple of years ago, we did a lot of work on masculinities and the ways in which terrorist organizations use gender and co-opt gender to recruit and to radicalize. And it's in the last couple of years, I've seen in UN meetings, increasingly member states are starting to raise masculinities as issues that they're bringing up when they're talking about what they're concerned about. That's been really interesting to see that impact. But we do have the data. And it's easy to dismiss gender as one of those UN-y kind of concepts, but researchers of terrorism in this room know how well terrorists can weaponize gender. And so if we don't pay attention to it, we're fighting with one arm behind our back. Human rights is another is a comparable situation. It's often dismissed as the area of the UN. It's a tangential idea to countering terrorism, and yet it's crucial to it. And we've talked about the role that it plays, and that the point at which a government gets it right or wrong in defending, protecting human rights while countering terrorism can be that point that either that breaks the terrorism cycle or tips us back into it. And CTED's work, I think, is very good in this space. Around about 15% of the recommendations that CTED makes that are endorsed by the Security Council that go to member states that we visit are about human rights and practical ways that human rights can be protected while countering terrorism. So the UN stuff is important.
In the time we have left, let me just put one more topic on the table. I've been in college classrooms 2 semesters, one in Princeton, one in Berlin. So different populations. They are watching TikTok. They are drowning in a sea of live feeds from Gaza. And my question to all of you, and watch the clock along with me, what does that mean? Is that a radicalizing event for these kids who have never seen war like this? You know, they are seeing it. What do you think?
I just turned it off. 2 quick things. Yes, on the short answer, yes. But the us versus them ideology, however it is designed, whether it is a neo-Nazi group that's trying to recruit, or it's ISIS or whomever, you're going to go to things that are happening in the world today. You're going to pick, these are savvy recruiters. They are not ancient people. They are peers recruiting peers. They're going to use current events. They're going to use things that make people laugh. They're going to use things that draw people in and build trust. We have talked about a deficit of trust across the world. People have no trust in government or world leaders or pick your thing. When you look at the climate that we are in terms of how a young person is growing up, alongside with the fact that they're on their social media device, their devices, and understand how addictive all of this is, you have a toxic mix. And so I think, yes, to Gaza for sure, the images, the narratives, all of it, but it's bigger than that. It is bigger than just Gaza. There are so many things that are happening today that are just a snap away from somebody saying, yeah, I'm on board with the way they are designing and talking about it. And just the other point I wanted to make about gender. There was a time when some people in this room, and I'm not going to mention names, who were the only voices who stood up and said women are getting radicalized. And the community looked at that person and said, that isn't real, it's not a big deal, we can look away. But in fact, it turns out that women can get radicalized. Can you believe it? Can you imagine that? They can get radicalized. I would say what I would want us to do is to understand whether you're male or female, whether you are straight or gay, whether you are Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Hindu, whatever you are, there are people out there who are going to try to recruit you for their nefarious ends. And we've got to be alert to the fact that this environment is one that you can't sort of say, oh, that's not a big thing anymore. Everything is connected. And I will end on that because I went to.
Yes, please.
Yep. Just on the Israel-Gaza thing, so we've, at the Strong Cities Network, we've been running an initiative called Global Crises, Local Impacts, which is basically looking at how communities, cities around the world that are thousands of miles from the conflict zone are feeling the impacts on their communities from including on university campuses. And what we've seen is how very few organizations, very few local governments, very few national governments are really investing in teaching communities how to talk about very, very sensitive issues. On university campuses, there's not enough going on in terms of how do you actually have a civil conversation about Israel-Gaza as opposed to an us versus them conversation. What is the right lexicon to use? Is the UN, which obviously isn't doing anything on this because it's compromised a little bit on this particular issue, it's hamstrung on this issue, who's putting out guidance for communities, for cities, for businesses, because workplaces are also being divided on this topic. And I feel like we're just sort of staring at the problem and hoping it goes away, thinking that, if there's a deal in Israel and Gaza in the current crisis, that the problem will go away. It's not going to go away. This is with us for a long time, and we better start investing in tools and resources to actually mitigate the fallout. And I'm not sure we are. I think we're still trying to put out fires.
Do you think the fact that the protests have, in some ways, calmed down, lets everybody off the hook?
Maybe for the time being, but I think the Israel-Gaza thing is just a manifestation of a problem, of a divide in our society, of also the disinformation and the misinformation that's out there. It's not just TikTok, the fact that TikTok exists, it's what you can do with videos on TikTok and how they can be manipulated and how the average young person doesn't know the difference between what's true and what's made up and what they see online. And that, I think, is a huge issue.
We definitely see countries that are very, very far away, very concerned about their citizens, particularly young citizens who don't have context, being influenced not just by that particular conflict, but by other conflicts or other grievances that they're seeing far away. They don't have the context. There are some proven digital literacy programs that work really well, but they're very small. It's very hard to scale that up and to react quickly to how quickly technology is changing. So yeah, that's going to continue to be a really big problem that we're going to see, I think.
Javed, you must be noticing it in your college
Well,
classroom.
as a college professor at the University of Michigan, this has been an issue on our campus over the past year. But that's not uncommon from lots of other places in the United States. And even as it affects any of us who sort of teach individually in the classroom, just sort of have to deal with this on a sort of subjective kind of case-by-case basis. But at least my perception, and having kind of switched hats into academia these last few years, this is the most divisive issue I've seen on our campus since I started teaching. And now, where it sort of moves after this, unclear. I don't think it's trending in any sort of direction of violence or anything like that. But in terms of creating wedges in the student population, yeah, I mean, that is an unfortunate dimension of what's happened. Hopefully, we're going to get back to the center, and maybe that will happen throughout the fall and the rest of the year. But initially, like in just the first few days after October 7th, I mean, I'd never seen students upset like that as I did because of what happened overseas.
Agree, and I think we have to wrap it up. You can see we're down to 0. Thanks so much for hanging out with us late in the afternoon. Don't drink the coffee, you won't go to sleep. And we shall talk among ourselves in the back room. Thank you. Thank you very much.